There's one aspect of liberalism, one way of thinking of it, which could be nicely contrasted with Dostoevsky's thinking, Dostoevsky's Dasein. So, of course, Dostoevsky has come out against Fourierism, this French form of socialism, but this specific French form of socialism, which he talks about or alludes to in Notes from Underground and in many places in his thinking, in his work, with the picture of, I think it's called the Crystal Palace, this London exposition example, but of course Fourier set up actual um, how should they be referred to? Well, they're cities that were, as it were, self uh, independent and supposedly run completely under certain rational principles. But you could say basically the idea, which runs over into these debates with Hayek against technocrats, as it were, which is that if one specific, to use the same analogy, somebody's diet, they worked out a diet to solve the problem of the question of the instinct to eat, the necessary need to eat. They worked out one specific manner of managing society, and then you can just look it up like a German train table, and you know what to do on every occasion, something like that. That's what Dostoevsky was partially against, and this is so. It's not really quite the same as a critique of Marxism. It's a critique of a specific interpretations of, in Thomistic terms, of the eternal law, um, understood and put down as a positive law, as though everything had been settled. And in some way, the Grand Inquisitor is this kind of city planner type who says, we know what's best. It's a kind of paternalism. We worked out the right diet for you. You need only follow it, and we'll work out the whole society on this basis. So, in this sense, when Dostoevsky says, if it were shown that the truth is against Christ, I would say with Christ, the truth is here, this logos truth, the logos as dialogic reasoning, which could then come up with these right answers, such as a right program of diet. And then one wonders in liberalism, when in the sense that liberalism is not merely taken to mean something like liberty in the ancient sense, for I'm no longer compelled to labor, so therefore I have leisure, and what should I do? What ought the human being do in their leisure, which is worthy of the dignity of a human being, which would then be schola, or some form of what's done in the university. One answer would be Thomas's answer, which would be to do theology and to discover these principles. Um, in liberalism, when it becomes, instead of something like this, a question like this, it becomes a question of economic freedom, and so that everyone, there becomes a dwelling where people take for granted that the main thing is who owns a thing, who's the property owner, and that each property owner then, as a private citizen, so as idiosyncratic creature within society where the is which is the only place where the terms private and public make sense, as a member of society, where society is supposed to be the private sphere, surrounded by the public sphere of the limited government as necessary evil, according to Thomas Paine's formulation. Um, then there's all these petty tyrants. Each property owner is a tyrant, and each property owner has absolute dominion over their property. And within that region, they decide what the diet is. Again, to use this analogy, they decide what's the proper reasoning and what's the train schedule we should keep to. And each one does it in their own idiosyncratic way. And this is like huge. It's almost like the privatization of Catholicism. Then, so each one is following this kind of Thomistic pattern of working out what the positive law is according to following this method of using reason to have higher participation in the natural law, and then to work out what the eternal law is. This is the right way to do it. This is, and no one can tell me otherwise. And each one has their own idiosyncratic way of doing it, or idiot way of doing it. So in this sense, and I think that's de facto the case with economic liberalism, which is one of the main forces at work in so-called planetary or global capitalism, is this form of so-called individualism, idiot individualism, property individualism. So in that, you can see that where Dostoevsky is coming from is somehow outside of that whole format of analyzing things, of doing things, of that habitat, that Western habitat. As I coded to this little reflection on West and East, I'll point out that there's from a more Marxist perspective, you can say there's a second interpretation to the schism, to the I think it's 1064 schism between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, which is that for the 500 years prior to that time, the physical conditions were vastly different. So the East was beset upon constantly by both by the rising Islam and by the Mongol hordes and so forth. Although also by even by the West itself, because I think only 60 years after the schism, during the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople fell for some time to Western Christendom. But the West, on the other hand, but that's after the schism. But we're talking about the 500 years before the schism. So the 500 years before the schism, the East was under totally different conditions, the conditions I just mentioned, than the West. And the West was basically kind of building up economically, socially, becoming more cohesive, developing everything which would later on blossom into the Renaissance, right? So the Renaissance was richly prepared, and the culture of the West and the culture of the East during that 500-year period, during that 1,000-year period leading up to the Renaissance, was the physically different conditions, and also, of course, the geographically different. So we could analyze the schism both from the basis of the question of the heresies, and from the question of Libitrium arbitrum, from these questions that stem back to the question of judgment, of weighing things, of casuistry, of reading principles into particular situations, of the whole juridical situation, of the tribunal of reason. And then we could think of this, there's heresies, there's discussions, the councils, there's discussions about various metaphysical questions, and these can be regarded as leading up to the break, to the schism of the East and West Church. But we could also look at it from this more blind materialistic view of what was happening in these societies and what physically led to this break. So the superimposition of those different forms of analysis, and whether one should be open to both of them, and how much weight one should be put on both of them. All these questions are obviously happening in the ego arbiter, as Cicero called it, within ourselves, within our judging selves, within the going back to the theoi, the devil on the right and the left in our judgments, in our weighing of issues, obviously comes in, and even asking the question whether we should prefer the materialistic version or prefer the judgment and inner and the logos reasoning version. Um, these two modes of analysis are constantly overlapping um, in Dasein.